Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're zeroing in on omega-3 fatty acids. You know, those power players, EPA and DHA, you find in fish and algae oil.
Mm-hmm.
You've likely heard they're good for you, maybe linked to heart health, brain power, but we're planning to go way beyond just the headlines today.
Exactly. Our mission really is to pull out the really important stuff from the research, give you a clear picture of what they do.
Yeah, things like their anti-inflammatory actions, how they impact different parts of your body, how much you might actually need.
And even how to pick a good quality supplement, which isn't always straightforward.
Right. Think of this as your shortcut to, well, maybe not becoming an omega-3 expert overnight, but definitely getting a solid understanding.
Yeah, you want the real science without getting totally bogged down in, the super technical jargon.
Right.
We're here to make sense of why these fats are so beneficial and help you make informed choices.
Okay, so let's get right to it then. Omega-3s, EPA, DHA.
Mm.
What are they fundamentally?
Okay, so simply put, they're essential polyunsaturated fats. Essential means our bodies can't make enough of them on their own. We have to get them from our diet.
Okay, essential. Got it. And polyunsaturated.
That just describes their chemical structure. They have more than one double bond in their chain. And omega-3 tells us where that first double bond is located, counting from 1 end.
Oh, okay.
We're mostly focusing today on EPA, that's eicosapentaenoic acid, it's a mouthful, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid.
Right, the famous ones.
Yeah, you often hear them called marine omega-3s because, well, they're abundant in fatty fish and algae.
Makes sense. So what do they actually do once they're inside us?
Well, they become really fundamental parts of our cell membranes. Imagine them woven into the very fabric of our cells.
Okay.
And this influences how flexible, how fluid those membranes are, which in turn affects how well they function. It's like keeping the cell machinery running smoothly. Super important for how cells talk to each other.
So basic cell function relies on them.
To a large extent, yes. And what's really interesting is we find very high concentrations of EPA and DHA, especially DHA, in our eyes, the retina, and in the brain.
Suggesting they're particularly vital there.
Exactly. Points to a crucial role in vision and our nervous system. Plus, they contribute to overall energy production, heart function, even hormone systems.
Now, what about the omega-3s you hear about from plants? Like flaxseed or chia seeds? ALA, right?
Right. ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, that's another essential omega-3, and it's actually the sort of parent omega-3. Our bodies can theoretically convert ALA into EPA and then further into DHA.
Ah, so we can make EPA and DHA from plant sources.
We can try, but the problem is that conversion process is, well, it's pretty inefficient in humans, really quite poor, actually.
How inefficient are we talking?
We're talking maybe 8 to 20% conversion of ALA to EPA in the best case scenario. And the conversion to DHA, that's even lower, like maybe 0.05% up to maybe 9%. It's tiny for DHA.
Wow, okay, so relying just on flax or chia might not give you much EPA or DHA at all.
Precisely. While ALA is definitely important itself, if you're aiming for the specific benefits associated with EPA and DHA, you probably can't rely solely on ALA sources. That low conversion rate really highlights why getting preformed EPA and DHA directly is, well, quite important for most people.
Right. So direct sources are key. Where do we find those mainly?
The primary dietary sources are those fatty, cold water fish. Think salmon, mackerel, tuna, herring, sardines.
The usual suspects.
Yeah. But here's a fun fact. The fish don't actually make the EPA and DHA themselves.
Oh, so where do they get it?
They get it from eating microalgae. The algae are the original producers in the marine food chain.
Ah, okay. So the fish are just the middlemen, basically.
Exactly. Which leads us nicely to the other main source.
Algae oil.
Precisely. Algae oil is extracted directly from these microalgae. It's a fantastic plant-based way to get DHA, and increasingly you can find algae oils that also provide EPA.
So you're going straight to the source.
Yep, and that has some real advantages. It's obviously perfect for vegetarians and vegans or people with fish allergies.
Sure.
And from a sustainability angle, cultivating algae is generally seen as more environmentally friendly than relying on wild fish stocks. Plus, algae oil usually has a lower risk of accumulating environmental contaminants like mercury or PCBs that can sometimes be an issue with certain fish.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Are there other sources worth mentioning quickly?
Yeah. Krill oil is another one. The omega-3s in krill are often in a phospholipid form, which some research suggests might be absorbed a bit differently, maybe more easily. And you also see some foods fortified with omega-3s, but the amounts are typically quite low.
Okay, good overview. We know what they are, where they come from. Now let's dive into one of the biggest reasons people take these supplements. their anti-inflammatory power.
Uh,
How do EPA and DHA actually, work to reduce inflammation?
Right. This is a really key area. First, remember that inflammation itself isn't bad. It's a vital defense mechanism.
Yeah, against injury, infection.
Exactly. But it's when it becomes chronic, when it just sticks around constantly at a low level, that it starts contributing to all sorts of major health problems. Okay. EPA and DHA have several really clever ways of helping manage this chronic inflammation. And a key insight here is that they don't just block inflammation, they also actively help the body resolve it. It's a two-pronged approach.
Okay, interesting. Not just blocking, but resolving.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
Okay, one major way is by influencing these signaling molecules called eicosanoids. They're kind of like local hormones made from 20 carbon fatty acids.
All right.
Now, inside our cell membranes, EPA and DHA compete for space in enzymes with another fatty acid called arachidonic acid, or AA. AA is an omega-6 fat, and it's, well, very common in typical Western diets.
So it's like a competition inside the cell membrane.
You could think of it like that, yeah. AA is the starting material for many eicosanoids that strongly promote inflammation, things like PGE2 and LTB4.
The pro-inflammatory ones.
Exactly. So when you have more EPA and DHA around, they essentially elbow AA out of the way. Less AA gets processed by those inflammatory enzymes.
Okay, so fewer inflammatory signals are produced.
That's part one. But part two is even cooler. When EPA does get processed by those same enzymes, it gets turned into a different set of eicosanoids like PGE3 and LTB5. And these are generally much less inflammatory. LTB5, for instance, is way less potent than LCB4.
Ah, so it's a double whammy. Less of the bad stuff, and the stuff that is made is weaker.
Precisely. It shifts the whole balance towards a less inflammatory state.
That's clever. You mentioned resolving inflammation, too.
Yes. This is really fascinating. EPA and DHA are precursors to a special class of molecules called specialized pro-resolving mediators, or SPMs.
SPMs, okay.
Think of them as the body's cleanup crew or peacekeepers for inflammation. They include things called resolvins, protectins, and maresins.
And what do these peacekeepers do?
Their job is to actively resolve the inflammation. They tell the incoming inflammatory cells to stop. They reduce the production of those pro-inflammatory signals we just talked about. They help clear away dead cells and debris, a process called efferocytosis, and they actually promote tissue repair.
Wow. So they're not just dampening the fire, they're helping rebuild afterwards.
Exactly. This active resolution is thought to be really crucial in chronic inflammatory diseases, where the off switch for inflammation seems to be broken. SPMs help turn it back on.
That sounds incredibly important for long-term health.
It really is. And there are other mechanisms too. Omega-3s can interfere with a key inflammation switch called NFB.
NF-kappa B.
Yeah, it's a master regulator that turns on lots of inflammatory genes. EPA and DHA can kind of jam that switch, reducing the production of inflammatory cytokines and enzymes right at the genetic level.
So they work on multiple levels.
They do. And finally, just by being incorporated into the cell membrane, they physically change its properties, its fluidity. This can affect how membrane proteins work and disrupt signaling platforms called lipid rafts, making immune cells less likely to overreact to inflammatory triggers.
Okay, that's a comprehensive picture of how they fight inflammation. Now, the practical question. What kind of dosages are needed to get these anti-inflammatory effects? Is my standard one-a-day capsule enough?
Probably not for significant anti-inflammatory benefits. The research suggests you generally need higher doses. We're often talking more than 2 grams per day of combined EPA and DHA.
More than 2 grams. Okay.
Yeah, for example, one study found that about 2.7 grams of EPA per day were needed to significantly cut down a key inflammatory marker, whereas a lower dose of about 1.3 grams didn't really move the needle much.
Interesting. A threshold effect, maybe?
Seems like it. Another study looked at people with obesity and used almost 5 grams a day, 3.2 grams EPA, 1.6 grams DHA for 3 months, and saw clear anti-inflammatory effects. So yeah, for tackling inflammation specifically, the standard low-dose supplement likely isn't going to cut it. You need a more therapeutic dose.
That's a really important takeaway. Dosage matters depending on the goal. Okay, let's switch gears now to another big area, cardiovascular wellness, heart health. How do omega-3s fit in there?
Right, they offer quite a range of benefits for the heart and blood vessels. It's multifaceted. One of the most well-established effects is lowering elevated triglyceride levels.
Triglycerides, okay. High levels are a risk factor, right?
Yes, a known risk factor for heart disease. Omega-3s are actually quite effective at reducing them,
How do they do that?
mainly by working in the liver. They seem to decrease the liver's production and secretion of VLDL, that's very low-density lipoprotein, the main carrier of triglycerides in the blood. They influence the genes involved in making fat in the liver. They might also help clear triglycerides from the blood a bit faster.
And what kind of dosages are we talking about for lowering triglycerides?
Again, generally higher doses, typically in the range of 2 to 4 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day. This is often prescription level territory or requires careful consideration, ideally under medical guidance.
Like,
Interestingly, even algal oil, specifically DHA, at around 1 to 1.2 grams per day has shown good results, reducing triglycerides by up to 25% in some studies.
so effective for blood fats. What about blood pressure?
Yes, they can help there too. Studies show modest but potentially meaningful reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. The effect seems to be more noticeable in people who already have high blood pressure.
How did that work?
It likely involves improving endothelial function, that's the health of the inner lining of blood vessels. Omega-3s can increase the production of nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide. That helps relax blood vessels, right?
Exactly. It causes vasodilation, helps improve blood flow. There's some suggestion that DHA might be particularly good for blood pressure compared to EPA. Meta-analyses show average reductions, maybe 1.5 points systolic, 1 point diastolic overall, but more in untreated hypertension. It might not sound huge, but even small drops can contribute to better long-term heart health.
Every bit helps. Now, the cholesterol question, HDL, the good, and LDL, the bad. What's the impact there?
It's a bit more complex with cholesterol. Omega-3s generally have a small positive effect on HDL cholesterol, potentially raising it slightly. Yeah, but the effect on LDL is, well, nuanced. Some studies, especially those using DHA-rich oils like algae oil, have actually shown a slight increase in LDL cholesterol levels.
An increase in bad cholesterol. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but there's a catch. Some evidence suggests that this increase might be primarily in the larger, less dense LDL particles. These are thought to be less atherogenic, meaning less likely to contribute to plaque buildup compared to the small, dense LDL particles.
So it's not just the total number, but the type of LDL particle that matters.
That's the thinking, yes. EPA taken alone might not raise LDL and could possibly even lower it slightly. It really highlights the limitation of just looking at the standard LDL-C number. Algal DHA studies, for instance, showed triglyceride reduction and HDL increase alongside that LDL increase.
Interesting distinction. What about heart rhythm and the general health of the blood vessel lining, the endothelium?
There's evidence suggesting potential antiarrhythmic effects, meaning they might help stabilize heart rhythm and reduce the risk of dangerous arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. This has been particularly noted in people who already have heart disease, often with doses around 850 milligram combined EPA plus DHA.
Okay.
However, there's a bit of a caution here. Some very recent large trials using high doses, like 4 grams a day, primarily for triglyceride lowering, found a slightly increased risk of developing atrial fibrillation, or AFib, in certain patients.
Oh, really? So very high doses might have a downside for some.
It appears so for AFib risk specifically. It suggests there might be an optimal range, and pushing to very high doses isn't necessarily better for everyone, especially regarding heart rhythm. It's something to discuss with a doctor if you have AFib or are at high risk.
Good to know. And endothelial function.
Yes, improved endothelial function is another benefit. That increased nitric oxide production we mentioned helps with vasodilation, but it also inhibits platelet stickiness and inflammation within the vessel wall. Omega-3s also seem to reduce oxidative stress there.
So putting it all together, what's the verdict on omega-3s reducing the overall risk of, say, heart attacks or strokes?
That's where the evidence gets a bit mixed, especially recently. Earlier studies often showed clearer benefits, but more recent, very large trials haven't always replicated those strong positive results, particularly in the general population without pre-existing heart disease.
Why the difference?
Several potential reasons. People in newer trials are often already on very good background, medical therapy, statins, blood pressure meds, etc. Baseline omega-3 intake might be higher now than it was decades ago. It could be that the added benefit of omega-3s is smaller when other risk factors are already well managed.
So the benefits might be more apparent in certain groups.
That seems likely. Higher risk individuals, like those who've already had a heart attack, secondary prevention, or those with very high triglycerides, might still see a clearer benefit. The American Heart Association still recommends about 1 gram per day for people with documented coronary heart disease.
And maybe the type matters too. EPA versus DHA.
Possibly. EPA seems more strongly linked to anti-inflammatory effects and maybe plaque stabilization, while DHA might have more impact on triglycerides, blood pressure, heart rate, and maybe that LDL particle size shift. This opens the door for potentially more personalized omega-3 therapy down the line.
Fascinating how the science keeps evolving. Okay, let's shift focus again to the brain. Cognitive function, mental health. How do omega-3s fit in?
This is a huge area, and DHA in particular is absolutely critical for brain structure and function. EPA also plays a role, maybe more related to mood and neuroinflammation.
DHA is critical how?
Well, DHA is the most abundant omega-3 fatty acid in the brain. It makes up a significant chunk, like 10–20% of the total lipids or fats in our brain.
Wow, that much?
Yeah, it's a major structural component of neuronal cell membranes, especially concentrated at the synapses, those crucial junctions where brain cells communicate, and also in the photoreceptor cells in our eyes.
So it's literally part of the brain's building blocks.
Exactly. Its presence influences that membrane fluidity we talked about earlier, which is vital for nerve signal transmission and for all the receptor proteins embedded in the membrane to work properly. It also helps organize those lipid raft signaling platforms within brain cells.
And this is important throughout life.
Absolutely. There's a massive accumulation of DHA in the brain during fetal development and early infancy. It's crucial for building the brain correctly from the start. But even as adults, our brains are constantly using and turning over DHA, about 4 milligrams per day.
Okay, so structurally vital. How does that translate into functions like memory and learning?
DHA is known to support synaptic plasticity. That's the brain's ability to change and adapt, strengthening connections, which is fundamental for learning and memory. It's involved in processes like long-term potentiation, LTP, a key mechanism for memory formation.
Right.
There's also some evidence it might boost levels of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like a fertilizer for brain cells, promoting their growth and survival.
And have human studies shown benefits?
Yes, quite a few. Particularly with DHA supplementation, studies have shown improvements in things like episodic memory, remembering events, learning, and even reaction time. These benefits have been seen across different age groups, but often most clearly in older adults experiencing mild memory complaints.
Like mild cognitive impairment, MCI.
Potentially, yes, or even just age-related memory changes. One meta-analysis found that taking over a gram a day of combined EPDHA improved episodic memory in older adults with mild issues. DHA alone, even at doses around 500 to 1,000 milligrams per day, also showed benefits. It's also been linked to increased activity in the prefrontal cortex during cognitive tasks.
That's really encouraging. What about mood? You mentioned EPA might be important there.
Yeah, there's a definite link being explored. Research has often found lower blood levels of EPA and DHA in individuals suffering from depression. And large population studies often show that people who eat more fish tend to have lower rates of depression.
So does supplementing help?
It shows promise. Several studies suggest that omega-3 supplementation, often rich in EPA, can be helpful for symptoms of depression and possibly anxiety, usually as an add-on to standard treatments rather than a standalone cure.
Why EPA specifically for mood?
The thinking is it might relate strongly to its anti-inflammatory effects, as neuroinflammation is increasingly implicated in depression. Dosages in these mood studies vary a lot, though, anywhere from 200 milligrams up to over 2,000 milligrams of combined EPA-DHA per day.
And pregnancy.
There's also evidence linking higher maternal DHA intake during pregnancy to a reduced risk of the mother developing depression or anxiety postpartum. But overall, more research is definitely needed to pin down the specifics for mood disorders, optimal doses, who benefits most, etc.
Okay, and the big concern for many as they get older, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Any potential protection there?
This is a really active area of research, and the hope is high. Omega-3s, particularly DHA, are being heavily investigated for their potential role in preventing cognitive decline and reducing the risk or slowing the progression of diseases like Alzheimer's.
What are the proposed mechanisms?
Several possibilities. Anti-inflammatory effects within the brain are key. DHA can activate anti-inflammatory pathways and inhibit NF-key. It might help with the clearance of amyloid beta plaques, which are characteristic of Alzheimer's. It also supports the myelin sheath that insulates nerve fibers and might even promote neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells.
So does the evidence support this? Observational studies? Intervention trials?
Observational studies looking at diets generally show a link. People who eat more fish or have higher DHA levels seem to have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's or dementia over time.
That sounds positive.
It is. However, the results from intervention trials where people are actually given omega-3 supplements have been more mixed.
Why the inconsistency?
It might be about timing. Some trials suggest benefits are more likely seen in people who are in the very early stages of cognitive impairment, like MCI. or perhaps in individuals who don't carry the main genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's, the APOE4 gene. It suggests there might be a critical window of opportunity where omega-3s are most effective, possibly more for prevention than for treating established disease.
So maybe more about supporting long-term brain resilience.
That seems to be the most promising angle right now, yes, focusing on maintaining adequate levels throughout life.
Okay, what about dosages for these various brain benefits across different stages?
Well, for pregnancy and breastfeeding, the recommendation is often an extra 200, 300 milligrams of DHA per day on top of regular intake, specifically for the baby's brain development.
And for kids?
Infant formulas are usually fortified. Some studies in children have used specific doses, like 600 milligrams of algal DHA for reading skills, or over a gram of DHA showing effects on brain activity.
Then for adults, focusing on cognition.
As mentioned, studies often use over 1 gram combined EPDHA daily, or maybe 500 to 1,000 milligrams of DHA alone, particularly for memory support in older adults.
And mood.
That's the one with the widest range in studies, maybe 200 milligrams up to over 2 grams combined, often with a higher proportion of EPA being suggested by some researchers.
Brain food indeed. Okay, let's move to another area plagued by inflammation. Our joints. Can omega-3s help there?
Yes, there's quite good evidence, particularly for rheumatoid arthritis, or RA.
RA, okay, that's the autoimmune one, right? Lots inflammation.
Exactly. Given what we know about EPA and DHA's anti-inflammatory actions, it makes sense they'd be studied for RA.
So how do they help in the joints specifically? Same mechanisms as before.
Pretty much, yes. Reducing the availability of that pro-inflammatory arachidonic acid in the joint tissues means fewer inflammatory eicosanoids like PGE2 get made right there where the pain is. Plus, they encourage the production of those pro-resolving SPMs we talked about, which can actively help to calm down the inflammatory process within the joint itself. And they can modulate immune cell activity and the production of inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta, which are major players in RA.
Okay, makes sense. So what have the human studies actually found for people with RA? Do they feel better?
Yes, the findings have been pretty consistent. Studies report modest but statistically significant reductions in joint pain intensity.
Okay, pain reduction. Anything else?
Reduced morning stiffness, which can be a big problem in RA. Fewer tender and swollen joints. And perhaps quite importantly, some studies show that people taking sufficient omega-3s were able to reduce their reliance on NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen.
Oh, that's a significant benefit, being able to cut back on NSAIDs.
Absolutely, because long-term NSAI use can have side effects. Some studies also show improvements in overall physical function and standard disease activity scores used by doctors.
Sounds promising for RA sufferers. What kind of dosages are we talking about here? Still the higher ones?
Yes, definitely on the higher end for joint benefits in RA. Most successful studies used at least 2.7 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day. Many used closer to 3.5 grams, and some went even higher.
So significantly more than a standard supplement.
Way more. The Arthritis Foundation, for instance, suggests people with RA might consider up to 5.2 grams of fish oil daily, aiming for at least 30% of that to be actual EPA and DHA.
And does it take time to work?
Yes, that's another key point. You typically need to take these higher doses consistently for about 2 to 3 months before you really notice the full benefits for joint symptoms. It's not a quick fix.
2 to 3 months. Good to manage expectations. Now, what about osteoarthritis OA? That's the wear and tear kind, much more common. Do omega-3s help there too?
The evidence for OA is much less convincing, unfortunately.
No, why not? There's still inflammation in OA, isn't there?
There can be a low-grade inflammatory component, but OA is primarily considered a degenerative disease, the breakdown of cartilage. The underlying process is different from the autoimmune attack in RA. And the clinical trials reflect this. Meta-analyses looking at omega-3 supplements for OA generally haven't found a significant effect on pain compared to placebo. Even studies using higher doses haven't shown clear benefits for knee OA pain.
So current guidelines probably don't recommend them for OA.
Generally, no. Due to the lack of strong evidence, fish oil isn't typically recommended in clinical guidelines for managing osteoarthritis. It really seems the specific type of joint problem matters a lot here.
That distinction is important. Okay, we've covered a lot of benefits and dosages. Let's circle back to the sources again. Fish oil versus algae oil. What are the key things people should consider when choosing?
Right, several factors come into play. First is the EPA and DHA content itself. Fish oil naturally has both, but the ratio and amount vary hugely. A standard 1,000 milligram capsule might only have 300 milligram combined EPHA, sometimes less. Concentrated ones have much more.
And algae oil.
Historically, algae oil was mostly DHA, but that's changed. Now you can easily find algae oils that provide good amounts of both EPA and DHA. For example, some popular brands offer around 300-ish milligram DHA and 150-ish milligram EPA per gram of oil. The crucial thing, no matter the source, is to read the label carefully for the specific amounts of EPA and DHA per serving. Don't just look at the total oil amount.
Good point. What about absorption bioavailability? Does the body use them equally well from both sources?
How well they're absorbed can depend on the chemical form they're in. Omega-3s can come as natural triglycerides, like in fish, ethyl esters, often in concentrates, reesterified triglycerides, converted back, phospholipids, like in krill, or free fatty acids.
Which forms are best absorbed?
Generally, the order is something like free fatty acids of phospholipids, reesterified triglycerides, RTG, natural triglycerides, TG, ethyl esters, EE.
Okay, so triglyceride forms, which are common in both fish and algae oil, are pretty well absorbed.
Yes, natural TG and the RTG forms are generally well absorbed and stable. Studies comparing algae oil, usually TG form, directly to fish oil or even eating salmon have found that the DHA is absorbed just as effectively. Bioavailability seems comparable for the triglyceride forms.
So in terms of effectiveness for health benefits, are they interchangeable if the dose is right?
Well, most of the big health studies historically used fish oil just because it was available first. But the evidence for algae oil is growing rapidly. Studies show it effectively raises blood levels of EPA and DHA, lowers triglycerides, and impacts cholesterol similarly to fish oil.
So the key is the EPHA dose and form, not necessarily the original source.
Largely, yes. If an algae oil supplement provides the right amount and a bioavailable form of EPA and DHA for your goal, you'd expect similar physiological effects to a feed oil providing the same.
And then there are the dietary and ethical aspects.
Exactly. Algae oil is the clear winner for vegetarians, vegans, and anyone with fish or shellfish allergies. It avoids the animals altogether.
And sustainability. Contaminants.
That's another plus for algae. It's cultivated, so it doesn't rely on wild fish stocks, which face overfishing pressures. And because it's grown in controlled environments, the risk of contamination with things like mercury, PCBs, or dioxins is inherently much lower than for ocean fish.
Although good fish oils are purified, right?
Reputable brands do purify their fish oil to reduce contaminants to very low levels, yes. But algae oil starts cleaner, essentially.
Okay, it sounds like algae oil is a really solid alternative, sometimes even preferable, depending on your priorities. Now, regardless of source, quality is crucial. You mentioned oxidation earlier. How big a problem is that?
It's potentially a significant problem. EPA and DHA are polyunsaturated, meaning they have multiple double bonds, which makes them chemically quite vulnerable to attack by oxygen. This is oxidation.
And what does oxidation do to the oil?
It degrades the beneficial fatty acids, so you lose potency.
Right.
Worse, it creates harmful byproducts, aldehydes, ketones, which can actually be detrimental to health. And of course, it causes rancidity, that awful fishy smell and taste. Exposure to oxygen, light, and heat all speed up this process.
So how can you tell if a supplement is fresh or oxidized? Is there a way to measure it?
Yes, there are specific lab tests. The main ones are peroxide value, PV, which measures early-stage oxidation products,
Okay.
ancidine value, AV, which measures secondary oxidation products like those smelly aldehydes that indicate rancidity.
Right.
And then there's the TOTOX value, total oxidation value. It's calculated as 2x PV plus AV, and it gives a good overall picture of the oxidation status.
And lower values are better.
Absolutely. Lower PV, AV, and 2-TOX mean a fresher, higher quality, safer, and more effective oil. High values mean it's potentially less beneficial, possibly even harmful, and definitely rancid.
Are there established standards or limits for these values?
Yes, the main industry group, GOED, Global Organization for EPA and DHA Omega-3s, sets voluntary standards for its members. They recommend PV should be no more than 5 milli-OKg, AV no more than 20, and 2-TOX no more than 26.
2-TOX below 26. Is lower even better?
Definitely. Many high-quality brands aim for much lower, maybe a TOX below 10, which would indicate very fresh oil.
The problem is, do companies actually put these TOTOX values on the label?
Unfortunately, most don't. It's not typically required, which makes it really hard for consumers to judge quality just by looking at the bottle.
Okay, so what can people do to try and get a quality product and avoid rancid oil?
Well, a few things. Choose reputable brands that are transparent about their quality testing, even if it's not on the label. Sometimes you can find reports on their website or by contacting them.
Okay. What else?
Look at the packaging. Opaque bottles or blister packs protect against light. Capsules generally protect the oil better from oxygen than liquid oils once the bottle is opened. Check for added antioxidants like vitamin E or rosemary extract, which help stabilize the oil.
And trusting your senses.
Yes, definitely. If your omega-3 supplement smells strongly fishy or tastes rancid or unpleasant, don't take it. That's a clear sign it's oxidized. Fresh, high-quality oil should have minimal odor or taste. And store it properly, cool, dark place, maybe even the fridge, especially for liquids after opening.
All really practical tips.
Yeah.
Right. Let's just quickly consolidate those dosages again. We've mentioned numbers throughout, but maybe a quick summary for key goals.
Sure. But remember, these are general guides based on studies. Individual needs can vary, and it's always best to discuss therapeutic doses with a healthcare provider.
Understood. So general heart health maintenance.
Maybe 250, 500 milligram combined EPA daily as a baseline. For documented heart disease, the AHA suggests around 1 gram, 1,000 milligram combined daily.
Triglyceride lowering.
That's where you need the higher doses, typically 2 to 4 grams, 2,000, 4,000 milligram combined EPA daily under medical supervision.
Joint health for IRA.
Again, higher doses. Studies suggest at least 2.7 grams, 2,700 milligrams, combined EPA daily, often closer to 3.5 grams, taken consistently for 2-3 months.
And cognitive support, say, for memory in older adults.
Studies often use upwards of 1 gram, 1,000 milligrams combined daily, or sometimes specific DHA doses of 500, 1,000 milligrams or more.
And general anti-inflammatory effects.
Likely needing doses over 2 grams, 2,000 milligrams combined daily to see significant systemic effects.
It really highlights how much the dose depends on the reason you're taking it. And you mentioned safety limits.
Yeah, the FDA considers up to 3 grams, 3,000 milligrams per day, generally recognized as safe, GRAS. Some bodies suggest safety up to 5 grams, but intakes above 3 grams really warrant discussion with a doctor due to potential increased bleeding risk, especially if you're on blood thinners, and the potential AFib risk at very high doses.
Okay, let's wrap up with safety generally and any interactions. Side effects common.
Generally well tolerated. The most common things are mild GI issues, fishy aftertaste, fishy burps, maybe slight indigestion or loose stools for some.
Annoying, but usually not serious. How to minimize those.
Taking capsules with meals often helps a lot. Starting with a lower dose and gradually increasing can also help your system adjust. Freezing the capsules is another trick some people use.
Good tips. What about interactions with medications? You mentioned blood thinners.
Yes, that's the main one. Since omega-3s can slightly thin the blood, combining them with anticoagulant drugs like warfarin or antiplatelet drugs like clopidogrel or even aspirin could potentially increase bleeding risk. Needs careful monitoring.
Anything else?
They might enhance the effect of blood pressure medications, so monitoring BP is wise if you start taking higher doses. There's a theoretical interaction with oral contraceptives, potentially reducing the triglyceride-lowering effect, but evidence is limited. The weight loss drug Orlistat can reduce fat absorption, so take omega-3s at least 2 hours apart from it. And very high fish oil intake might slightly deplete vitamin E, though many supplements add it back in.
And specific populations. Pregnancy, allergies.
Pregnancy, breastfeeding. DHA is crucial, as we said. Choose purified fish oil or algae oil to avoid mercury. Consult your doctor. Allergies. Fish shellfish allergic individuals should avoid fish oil. Algae oil is the safe alternative. AIB. If you have a history or high risk, discuss doses over 1G day with your cardiologist. And always distinguish fish body oil from fish liver oil, like cod liver oil, which is high in vitamins A and D that can be toxic in large amounts.
This has been incredibly comprehensive. So, to quickly recap, EPA and DHA are powerful fatty acids with potential benefits across inflammation, heart, brain, and joint health, working through some really interesting mechanisms. But the key takeaways seem to be that informed choices are critical. You need to think about the source fish versus algae based on your needs and values. You need the right dose for your specific health goal, which is often higher than standard supplements for therapeutic effects. And quality matters immensely. Avoiding oxidized rancid oil is vital for safety and efficacy, even if it's hard to assess from the label sometimes.
Exactly right. It's not just about taking an omega-3 supplement. It's about taking the right kind at the right dose in a high-quality form. While research is ongoing, especially on things like optimal EPA-DHA ratios or long-term algae oil effects, understanding the current science really empowers you to make better decisions for your own well-being.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of that today. It's been a fantastic deep dive. We really hope this is giving you, our listener, some valuable and practical insights into the world of omega-3s.
Hope so too.
Maybe take a moment to think about what stood out most to you and perhaps explore a bit further based on your own health goals and what you've learned today. Thanks for joining us.